Okay, excerpt from A Voice in the Wilderness. Let's take a look at this passage. So right away, I want to know who's telling the story, what kind of passage is it, what's their attitude or tone. I want to know the main idea of the passage, which is essentially the topic and why we care about that topic. And I also want to walk away with some organization of ideas. I kind of want to reverse engineer what the author's progression of ideas were. So I want to be able to follow along with that because that will relate to a lot of questions. So with that, let's take a quick look. Right away, the paragraphs are very short. We'll see that. There are a couple different presentations on the SHSAT. You can have very long paragraphs, and you have very short, one, maybe two sentence. Here it's 1 to kind of 3 to 4 sentences per paragraph, which means, by the way, we're going to have to pull together maybe 2-3 paragraphs as they label it to get kind of the idea of what's going on in what would be, I would call, a normal paragraph. So with that, let's take a look and see the reading.
With a lurch, the train came to a dead stop, and Margaret Earle, hastily gathering up her belongings, hurried down the aisle and got out into the night. It occurred to her, as she swung her heavy suitcase down the rather long step to the ground, and then carefully swung herself after it, that it was strange that neither conductor, brakeman, nor porter had come to help her off the train, when all three had taken the trouble to tell her that hers was the next station, but she could hear voices up ahead. Perhaps something was the matter with the engine that detained them, and they had forgotten her for the moment. The ground was rough where she stood, and there seemed no sign of a platform. Did they not have platforms in this wild western land, or was the train so long that her car had stopped before reaching it?
So what's a quick recap of the first 3 paragraphs? Margaret was on a train in the Wild West. She got off. She thought it was strange because she was told it was her next stop. And then she was clearly uncertain. Perhaps something was the matter. And she asked the questions, did they not have platforms in this wild western land? She's confused at this point after she got off the train.
She strained her eyes into the darkness, and tried to make out things from the 2 or 3 specks of light that danced about like fireflies in the distance. She could dimly see moving figures away up near the engine, and each one evidently carried a lantern. The train was tremendously long. A sudden feeling of isolation took possession of her. Perhaps she ought not to have got out until someone came to help her. Perhaps the train had not pulled into the station yet, and she ought to get back on it and wait. Yet if the train started before she found the conductor, she might be carried on somewhere, and he'd justly blame her for a fool. There did not seem to be any building on that side of the track. The track. It was probably on the other, but she was standing too near the cars to see over. She tried to move back to look, but the ground sloped and she slipped and fell in the cinders, one bruising her knee and cutting her wrist. In sudden panic she arose. She would get back into the train, no matter what the consequences. They had no right to put her out here, away off from the station, at night, in a strange country. If the train started before she could find the conductor, she would tell him that he must back it up again, and let her off. He certainly could not expect her to get out like this.
So in paragraphs 4 to 6, what happens really quickly? Well, she's straining her eyes to look around. She can't see too well. She feels a little alone or isolated, according to the language. And she's still uncertain, denoted by keywords like perhaps, perhaps. And she couldn't see a building, but it was maybe on the other side. She just didn't know, right? Then the event happened. She slipped and fell. In a panic, she tried to get up and get back on the train, no matter what she was going to. Now, in this literary excerpt, this fiction passage, note how I'm reading it, what I'm focusing on and underlining. I'm underlining not just the first sentence of paragraphs like I might do in a nonfiction case. I'm reading it more closely. I'm picking up on certain words, strong punctuation, some feeling words, like, for example, I see question marks, perhaps, perhaps. The repetition here seems to be indicating that the main character is confused. And then I pick up on other feeling words like she's isolated, and after she falls, there's panic. All these occur within the paragraphs as well. So it's a slightly different exercise. We're reading a little more closely as we proceed. By the way, the time it took for the reader to read the entire passage beginning to end at this pace is just over 4 minutes. So generally on the exam, you would try to want to read in 3 minutes, which you could probably read faster than the reader here just for the video purposes. So remember, you actually have time to, well, read it out aloud to yourself, absorb what's going on, try to understand it. Don't race through it. Don't be rushed by the exam.
She lifted the heavy suitcase up the high step that was even farther from the ground than it had been when she came down, because her fall had loosened some of the earth, and caused it to slide away from the track. Then, reaching to the rail of the step, she tried to pull herself up, but as she did so the engine gave a long snort and the whole train, as if it were in league against her, lurched forward crazily, shaking off her hold. She slipped to her knees again, the suitcase, toppled from the lower step, descending upon her, and together they slid and rolled down the short bank, while the train ran giddily off into the night. The horror of being deserted helped the girl to rise in spite of bruises and shock. She lifted imploring hands to the unresponsive cars as they hurried by her, 1, 2, 3, with bright windows, each showing a passenger, comfortable and safe inside, unconscious of her need. A moment of useless screaming, running, trying to attract someone's attention, a sickening sense of terror and failure, and the last car slattered itself past with a mocking clatter, as if it enjoyed her discomfort. Margaret stood dazed, reaching out helpless hands, then dropped them at her sides and gazed after the fast-retreating train, the light on its last car swinging tauntingly, blinking now and then with a leer in its eye, rapidly vanishing from her sight into the depth of the night. She gasped and looked about her for the station that but a short moment before had been so real to her mind, and, lo, on this side and on that there was none.
So let's quick summarize what we learned in paragraphs 7 to 10. She tried to pull herself up. Remember, in 6, she was determined to get on the train again, but she slipped to her knees again. She slid and rolled down a short bank, while the train ran giddily off into the night. Well, she tried, but she did not, as determined as she was, get back on that train. The horror. She lifted up imploring hands to unresponsive cars. So she's now feeling horror because she's off the train and the train's going away. As we go to paragraphs 9 and 10, a moment of useless screaming, running, trying to attract someone's attention. She feels terror. She feels failure. And she stood dazed in paragraph 10, helpless hands, then dropped them to her side. So now she's, looks like she's giving up, and gazed after the fast retreating train. So she fell again, and the train went on despite her attempts to get somebody's attention. Notice here, not underlined, but we have some figurative language. We have a personification of the train. It's mocking her. It's leering an eye at her, tauntingly. It's doing things that only a human would do. So that might be important come into a personification question.
The night was wide like a great floor shut in by a low, vast dome of curving blue set with the largest, most wonderful stars she had ever seen. Heavy shadows of purple-green, smoke-like, hovered over earth darker and more intense than the unfathomable blue of the night sky. It seemed like the secret nesting place of mysteries wherein no human foot might dare intrude. It was incredible that such could be but common sagebrush, sand, and greasewood wrapped about with the beauty of the lonely night.
Okay, in paragraph 11, she looks about. She's sort of given up at this point. She looks about and realizes what had just a short moment ago been so real, assuming she thought she was at a stop. And lo, on this side and on that, there was none. So essentially, she's just figuring out, now that she's given up on the train, that she's caught in the middle of the Wild West. And then, if that were the case, I would be freaking out. I might be yelling, who knows what. Paragraph 12 talks about the night was like a wide, great floor with most wonderful stars. And it was the beauty of the lonely night. And an unfathomable blue sky. Essentially, this is giving the idea that it's a beautiful scenery. Well, what the heck? Why is that coming after her being stranded on a train that ran away from her in the Wild West? Kind of an unusual turn there for paragraph 12. Something I would keep note of. Lastly, paragraphs 13, 14, and 15 to the end basically point out that there were no other lights streaming anywhere. She was definitely not even a tree. She was definitely alone. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. So here she is, alone in the Wild West. And then 14, 15 lead up to kind of the punchline of the story. She finally gets up to the point where they had stopped, far down where the train was, and she realizes what happened. She sees that it's a drinking tank for the engine and not a regular stop. That's kind of the final punchline. And again, remember in fiction stories, that punchline, that lesson usually comes right at the end.